Hello, welcome back to this podcast. Today's topic is stigma in special education. I want to talk about how the stigma, which is another word for discrimination, it's a nice word that we use instead of saying we discriminate against special education people. I want to talk about how there's a stigma against families, students, and teachers when it comes to special education. And it actually prevents people from being able to access the services that they have rights to because they are afraid of being discriminated against. There's a lot of supports that can be given to students with special education, but just saying those words out loud is often very difficult for parents and students to hear because our brains are telling us that that's an extremely bad thing and that we don't want to be associated with it. So usually when I tell people I'm a special education teacher, they're like, oh, okay, like, damn, like, God bless you. But they don't really know what I do day to day because it's a brand new position and I mainly work with all students throughout the day. And the parts of me that make me a special education teacher are mainly just paperwork. I feel that most people don't understand what being a special education teacher means or what being a special education student is in 2021, or being a parent or family member of a student that has an IEP. Basically, I would say there's a high probability of you having a family member that has special education services nowadays. It's very common. So it shouldn't be something that's discriminated against. That's only hurting students in the long run and families to get the supports that they need. So I thought it was a super interesting topic to talk about because I've been able to see this. I've been able to see this firsthand as a special education teacher and having to talk to parents and explain to them what's going on and then kind of guiding them through their thought process of like what is the correct thing to do by providing them the information. Like even though theoretically it's always a good idea, like emotionally it's still a very hard decision to make for parents. And I work with students that they completely understand there's a stigma of having an IEP because other students view them differently and they might get made fun of, and their teachers treat them differently as well. And even as a special education teacher, I'm treated differently by my peers as well, just by association of someone that works with special education students. For one reason or another, I can't really correlate that, but I have a suspicion that because I'm working so closely with these students that I might get mixed up with them, which is, I like that, but I'm not sure if they understand where that discrimination is coming from or if they realize that it's coming across to me as discrimination. Subconsciously, when we hear that someone has special education or is receiving mental health services, we automatically like wince towards it and we don't want to be associated with that person as eagerly as we used to. So I see that reaction in people when I talk about either receiving mental health therapy myself or having to talk to parents about how their child is being evaluated for special education services. Which in my mind, I'm like, oh my God, this is great. Like, this kid is finally going to get the support they needed this whole time. Like, let's get this process started. But when you say a statement like that to a parent that doesn't really know what I know, they're like, oh my God, like, this is terrible. Like, my kid, he didn't have a learning disability. He wasn't in special education before, and now he's going to be in special education. And that means that, the R word, I'm not going to say it, but a lot of people, I used to say it a lot back when I was a teenager. I didn't know it was so bad, but like people really, you either, if you have special education, you're in this new bin where you are less than human. I think that's the assumption that people operate under, and people don't really kind of spell it out because it's very nasty to say out loud, but that's the assumption. Like, if your student has an IEP and receives special education services, then they are now considered the R word, which means that they're less valuable than a regular human, that they are now in this category where they are stupid and they can't do anything and they're not going to be able to take care of themselves, which is completely untrue and hurtful to hear people make these assumptions about students that they probably were having a hard time with, and definitely need more support with. And it's not like they're the only parents struggling with these behaviors, or they're the only students struggling with this work, because many students are, especially now during distance learning. So for me, it's difficult to see kind of parents, sometimes they deny the whole thing from happening, and parents ultimately have 100% of say whether or not we can proceed with like the special education services, like the evaluation, or if their child even receives special education in the first place. Like, even after they've been evaluated, a parent can stop it at any time. So sometimes parents are like, no, that's not true, and then they just, they don't sign the papers, and then we can't support their student more with like RSP services, so they wouldn't be able to be taken out of class or receive any other supports that they might need. And then sometimes parents like reluctantly do it, sign, and then their students qualify, and then when their students qualify, it's actually a great thing because they'll most likely have an IEP until they graduate high school. And once they graduate high school, they will be able to use their last IEP from high school to receive accommodations at the college level. So having more time during their exams and testing in another room, which is usually a really great thing for most people. I always try to communicate that with parents that this is good, like it's gonna help no matter what. And yeah, like it's gonna have a big impact on the amount of support that they receive and how successful they feel in school. Because I wish I would have had an IEP, because I needed a lot of support, and I needed to just talk to someone that had gone through school or knew what path I was gonna take, because I had a lot of silly ideas about education and how I was gonna get through it, which I could explain right now. I thought that I was gonna be able to complete everything the first time that I saw it. I thought that turning in assignments wasn't important. But these are all things that I found out weren't true, and would have been nice to hear from someone that had gone to college and told me how silly they were. But I'm not sure if I would have heard that at that young age, so who knows? One thing I do want to mention is that parents, at times, they just want to ignore or run away from the possibility, because being labeled as a special education student seems really detrimental for them in the long run, just based on how our society treats people with special education, that are considered special education, or that have mental health issues that they need support with. So they rather like run away from that reality, because they feel that if they accept it, then they're actually hurting their child in the long run. Or sometimes parents are like, my child is normal at home and they don't need any extra help, which to me, I'm like, oh, well, you don't ask your child to write an essay at home, or you don't ask your child to do math at home. Like, you're in a different environment, and they're going to react differently at school than they do at home, because it's completely different. Now, school and home are almost the same. When we were in person, that was something that I commonly heard from parents saying that, oh, their child is normal, and I like normal, like I don't know what they mean by normal, but they emphasize normal. So I think there's value in trying to understand what they mean by that, or I'll try to piece out what they mean by normal. I think by normal they mean a student that doesn't have special education supports, which means that they're just like a regular student and that they're valued. Because if they were not normal, they would have special education supports, and then that would make them the R word, which would make them less than human, or just, not worth anyone's time. Normal, that they act normal at home, maybe that means they that they do their work at home, but that's not true. So that they don't do their work at home, maybe that's the assumption, that students shouldn't do their work at home. I don't know. My parents always wanted me to do my work at home. I would just be like, yeah, it's done. I did it at school. Which kids still use that, and parents still buy that, which is amazing. I'm like, really? Doesn't look like you do much. Um, and like we all have our avoidance, like avoid hard things, which I don't blame anyone for doing. It's just a survival mechanism. I've worked with students in elementary and high school, and kids like as early as like third grade. I don't know if it has to do anything with special education, but when they work with the teacher, the other kids are like, "Oh, ha 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 ha, you need help." Like the like working with the teacher. I think at a certain age, there's like it's at first it's a privilege, and then it becomes like humiliating. Um, and there's a lot of reasons that can happen. The way that the teacher themselves actually makes that event happen could be humiliating, or it could be a reward. And I that definitely can happen from like meaning kindergarten to 12th grade. Um, I always try to make it a reward for my students to work with me. Um, but sometimes like it's deeply ingrained in like smaller children's minds that like um, it's humiliating to work with anyone else, like to need any type of help. And we like kids pick this up from their parents. Like kids don't inherently know this. They pick it up from. They're not to blame parents. They pick it up from their teachers. They pick it up from staff. They pick it up from their caretakers and their family, the people that they actually interact with. Kind of like how we do the same for like racism and classism and sexism. Just pick it up along the way. So this whole notion of needing extra help is like it's deeply ingrained in us, that, or at least in the United States, in the schools that I've worked with, that like I don't need that. Like no, I'd rather just like suffer and die, basically, um, or not learn anything at all. And that's my perspective as someone. That's my perspective as someone in power that has been through that system. Like, you better ask right now. This is free right now. Like, the help is so expensive when you actually need it. It is so expensive, and no one's gonna want to help you once you're over 18 for free anymore, for the most part. So something that, and like this word help, it triggers people. It seems that's like a dirty word. It triggers students. It triggers adults. So like personally, when I work with students, I try to use the word support, and I pick that up along the way. Like, how can I support you? I try to use that word more than help. Sometimes I say help, um, but usually by then I have a pretty good relationship with that person where they don't feel threatened by me saying that. But definitely when I start meeting new students and stuff, I always try to use the word support, because I am aware that the word help triggers a lot of students. There's a lot of mental barriers behind that, and I think that the mental barriers come from um, not being, not wanting to appear weaker than others, and like if you need more help, then you're weaker than others, which I don't really agree with that. And the world is too big of a place to just kind of simplify things that whether you need help in the moment, that means that you are instantly weaker. And like, what category are we even talking about? Or like your capacity to learn. Because, like bean sprouts, they grow really fast. And a tree takes a really long time to grow. Is a beanstalk or sprout better than a tree? Maybe. Is it faster than to sprout from the ground? Probably. Does it grow faster? Yeah. Does it grow bigger? No. Is it gonna live longer? No. Like, it depends on what category you judge things by. So I don't know. I just don't think things should be as simplified as they are. But students really internalize this kind of stuff. And I think also as adults, we internalize these things. We think like, oh, if a person with disabilities is in my classroom or in my like study group or whatever situation you might find yourself in the workplace, then that means that they are going to slow down the group, that they are somehow not capable of fully participating, which I see that like, no one intends to have these thoughts unless you actually follow your thought through and how it affects your day-to-day actions or like how you perceive things. Because just because like someone recently told me like, oh yeah, there was some people with disabilities in this program that I was in, but they participated fully and it was great. And for me, I'm like, of course they participated fully. Like, I'm sure you guys accommodated them in some sort of way um, for them to do that. And my assumption is never for them to not participate fully. So it's so much easier to kind of just reject this idea that, okay, so like that's bad, so I reject it. Like, I'm not a student with a disability. Like, I don't need support. Like, that's bad, so I'm not going to be that person. Uh, but that actually hurts, that hurts everyone involved. To spare themselves some humiliation, I see that some students rather not work with their RSP teachers because they don't want to be singled out and they don't want to kind of receive that feedback from their peers and their teachers that they needed extra support. And another way that I see that manifesting is general education teachers. They they hold special education students to a different degree of accountability at times. Like if they're like, oh, you didn't complete the assignments, like you had extra help. Like if you're not completing the work, then you don't deserve that extra help. So to me, that means a lot of different things. That means that they're viewing special education as something that you can only get if you deserve, which deserve in terms of the merit of the work that you turn in. Um, but that's not how it's determined. It's just like, do you have a learning disability? Yes or no? Like, you don't have to turn in anything to have a learning disability. You have a learning disability whether you're in school or not. So there's that. And the other thing that confuses me about that is if they didn't turn it in, then you actually need more support, or the supports that are being given are not sufficient, whether that be at school or at home, for that student to be successful. So we need to reflect on that and actually change our approach of working with the student, because coming at them with this like negative or like blaming mentality isn't going to change anything. it's just gonna further internalize like shame and like not really wanting to work with that teacher anymore. And the stigma and discrimination that special education teachers face, and I've heard this as soon as I was in my teacher program, is that there's always this tension in between general education teachers and special education teachers. Like general education teachers are like, hey, you SPED teachers, that's like the little term. SPED is like the slang word for special education teachers. They're like, you SPED teachers like don't do enough, like you're just like not doing anything all day. And then SPED teachers are like, oh, like, the gen ed teachers, just a little abbreviation of general education. You gen ed teachers like don't understand and like aren't flexible enough with your students. So, and like at first I was like, that's silly. Like, what kind of person would fall into such a like a trope like that? Like pitting, like we're all here for the students, right? But really, I've experienced it firsthand. It's just the way that the system is set up currently in our society or in our state or country, that there's not enough time for everyone to do everything, so it's really easy for us to just kind of like fight against each other. But generally special education teachers are seen as less qualified and not being able to meet the standards of a regular teacher. And I understand that there's some like misunderstanding of what special education teachers do, um, and why we will be perceived in that way. But oftentimes, that's not really true. And sometimes I gotta stun some people. Like, I'm like, hey, I have a master's degree. I'm a bilingual certified teacher. I've been teaching for X amount of years. And they're like, oh, okay, like, never mind. Oh, and if I really want to flex on them, I could be like, I have a clear credential. Like, do you have a clear credential? Okay. Uh, so oftentimes, yeah, like that perception really comes back, like to bite people in the booty. The perception that SPED teachers are less qualified is something that's holding teachers back from collaborating with each other and really trying to help out students uh, learn, which is why we're both there. Both camps are there. And the reason why I mentioned this is because like SPED teachers also have to deal a lot with a lot. We need to advocate for our students and for the families of the students to kind of receive the services that they're entitled to. Like outside of the school, they can receive, depending on what state they're in, they can receive supports from the state as well, for different like counseling, for job employment, for additional academic supports outside of the school as well. So, we're advocating for our students to get their supports at school. We're advocating for their families as well to continue receiving supports. And we're also advocating for ourselves on our own staff to kind of have the time to be able to do all our work and to be seen as equals. We really want our students with disabilities to access the material to gain something meaningful out of their educational experience. That's the overall goal. So in my day-to-day, no one calls me a special education teacher because, of course, there's stigma, discrimination behind that. Like, it'll be very obvious what I would be. So what students and other staff members call me is an RSP teacher, which stands for resource teacher. I don't know why it's abbreviated that way. Maybe someone can tell me, but I don't know. But it's abbreviated RSP teacher. So it's the resource teacher, supposed to help the teacher, they help students, blah, blah, blah. So it's wonderful the way that that's framed, but it's no secret for the students that I am there to help specific students because I am consistently working with certain students, even though I may be working with the whole classroom. I definitely focus on a particular group of students at times. And to them, it's not a secret most of the time because most schools are doing like cohorts where kids are going through school together since they're like in kindergarten to like high school. If they live in the same neighborhood, then they definitely have seen each other in the same classrooms, in the same community. So it's not a secret that someone has additional services. Um, and I've had the privilege of being part of some really great cohorts of students where like, the all the students are like super accepting and they're like supportive of their friends and like they actually support each other to kind of complete the work and and not that they don't like bully each other and like talk smack about each other after school, but like for the most part they're like super supportive. Because when I remember going to school, like my friend, like we were really mean to each other and we weren't really trying to help each other achieve any goals like that. So shout out to this Gen Z. They're awesome. They're very supportive. Um, yeah, and like it just kind of depends on the environment that adults create for students because at times like I could really be seen as a resource to the other students. Like, oh, like I didn't get what the teacher said. Like, can you like re-explain it to me? Um, and that's that's natural. Like if there's two different adults, then even if we're doing the same lesson, like we're both explaining it in different ways. Something that I might say might resonate more with certain students than what the other teacher says, and vice versa. Like that's just how it works. Like it's not like, oh, like I'm a better teacher or he's a better teacher. Um, and then like people have bad days too. So if someone has a bad day, the other person can really pick up the pace for the class and kind of push things along. So it's awesome when it works, when there's two teachers in the same classroom that are both there with on the same page. Awesome when it works. But yes, students notice things like way faster than what adults perceive, and they act upon like their perceptions of what is rewarded and not, like way faster than what you would expect. So if when it's time for testing and I take certain students out, like if the teacher presents it in like a really weird and awkward manner, then like some kids might say like, "Oh, I want to go," like, and then like it becomes this weird like, it becomes weird when like kids without an IEP are like requesting small group testing, and it always happens too because they're like, "Oh man, like I want to do that. Like that seems way funner than like being in this room," or like, and then I think that's what gets uh the my general education teachers, that like they perceive that we're having fun and that they're not gonna like, not that they don't complete their tests, but that it's somehow fun and it shouldn't be fun. um I always try to generate some kind of excitement for what we're doing and joy, um because if not I wouldn't be doing that job. But like kids pick up on that and they're like, oh, I want to be a part of that, like that seems cool. Or but then it becomes like this weird like moment where we have to like clarify, and we have to clarify, but we don't have to go through everything. So it just becomes really muddled, like if our explanation doesn't come off like really strong for the students. Like, oh no, like they need the extra support. That like that is not an explanation that I would want to be given. I would want us to be like, hey, I'm not sure how it would be. I'm not sure how we could clearly state that some students just need more supports than others, and there's like a legal binding document that says that this person can test in a separate room. And I think that's when other students might get upset, like, man, like that should have been me, blah blah blah. And then they might say something to their classmates at that point. That's not nice. But Usually, I think it's just established that I work with a particular set of students and that I might take some of them out. And sometimes I do take out students that don't have IEPs to work with them, but I always have to have a conversation beforehand with uh, the general education teacher. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's difficult to navigate, but it's not a secret. Like it's not a secret, but like kids don't ever hear the term special education thrown out. Like they hear IEP probably from the teachers and myself at times. And I always try to explain to students like, hey, like, you have an IEP, this means this, like it means that you have a learning disability. It doesn't mean that you're a terrible person. It just means that it's harder for you to do certain things. And we're gonna figure out how to get through this school thing despite this learning disability. We're gonna learn how to get through the school thing despite this learning disability. And you just have extra support this year with me, and let's get to work. That's basically my whole spiel. Um, so yeah, like the only thing that I can really do as an educator, as a special education educator, is to like really build strong relationships with my students, in order for them not to feel shame, not and not that they wouldn't feel shame surrounding working with me, because there's so many different pressures that like I can't actually control, like what their peers think of them, or like what their peers say on social media, or what their teachers might say, like offhand comments and stuff like that. So I really need, I always try to focus on a strong relationship with the student. That way that they feel confident that I have their back, and that I'm advocating for them. And that they see some sort of results, and they're putting their reputation on the line, their neck on the line, like risking humiliation. So I really want them to feel rewarded by working with me. So like I want them to be like, oh, like the 20 minutes that I paid attention to Mr. Rivera, that really helped me. Like it saved me like 5 hours worth of like feeling just despair, by not doing my work at home or whatever. Because uh, I feel that understanding is the greatest motivator, and that's something that I got like from the Baha'i writings. Like I'm not sure what the quote is exactly, but it just resonated with me that like once you understand things, like you don't really need motivation to do it. Like it's just exciting to do it on your own. So just being able to work with students and give them that initial like understanding that they need, then they like improve dramatically. And it's not because I have a secret teaching technique. It's just because I built up their confidence and like give them like foundational skills in order to tackle things on their own. Uh, I really admire all the students that have navigated the whole stigma around special education, because I know it's ever present. Like I'm sure that people try to ignore it in their family, like they don't talk about it as much, and like that's really how discrimination and stigma are built upon, like people not talking about it and then just having their own ideas, because it's really not that big of a deal, but people make it seem like, oh, it's the end, like you are now worthless, or that person is less worth less because they actually have an IEP or they see a therapist. It's, I mean, that's why in part I want to continue doing this podcast, because a lot of people I know don't really know exactly what I do, and I don't really have the energy to kind of explain to them exactly what I do every single time the opportunity arises. So I could just explain it once and post it on the internet and redirect them towards it. And hopefully people can use this as a resource to kind of share with their family and other educators that they would like to hear more about things like this. I have talked about stigma in special education that doesn't allow parents to have students receive the supports that they need. and it doesn't allow students to fully want to work with their new providers because of this discrimination that they face at home and from their peers and their teachers. Because it's so difficult with outward appearances, it's difficult for the mindset of special education to happen. Like, imagine being a young person and just being so like hyper aware of what people think of you and how you, like, it's so difficult for kids. Um, just thinking about that age group. And then maybe something new that we've all learned is how young students can pick up on this stigma we have around special education, like how early they feel it in their own lives. Um, but something that we can definitely do to combat that is by being collaborative with each other, like parents, teachers, and just the learning community. So, like, making sure that our classrooms are inclusive and that everyone's needs are being met, which is a challenge because we can't actually meet everyone's needs within the class. We've learned that students feel stigma. We've learned that students feel stigma at a very young age, and that we need to build up their confidence so they can feel successful in school and kind of combat this stigma, be able to talk about their own disabilities in a way that's empowering to them and to their families. I think I was looking at a website earlier that said that stigma in the CDC, it like results in like isolation. Having a learning disability or like mental health issues is not like something that's rare in our society, but it feels like it. It's super isolating, and like people don't want to talk about it because they feel like they're gonna get called out or that it's gonna harm them. So we need to kind of turn that around, and one way of doing that is by talking about it. So that's what I'm attempting to do here to kind of inform more people about what special education is and like how we can be more supportive of those in special education. So I want to thank you for listening to this whole podcast. It's been a journey. I've been learning a lot of things about making podcasts, from like recording to like writing to editing. So they're only going to get better. And my next topic is going to be about hidden disabilities and what that really means. And this one's I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about like disabilities outside of the school context as well, but definitely affect our students as well during their school careers and after their school careers. I want to thank you guys so much for listening to this whole thing. Make sure to follow the little podcast and rate it 5 stars if you're on Apple. It'll really help me out a lot. And I hope you have a wonderful day.